Modernism. A distinct change occurred in the evolution of Western culture, beginning sometime in the late 19th century and coming to fruition sometime around the Second World War. This change in art, technology, philosophy, or human behavior is generally called modernism. Modernism draws its inspiration from Freud, Marx, Darwin, and Nietzsche. Modernism first manifested itself in the painting and then in the works of Ezra Pound, Filippo Marinetti, and James Joyce, to name but a few. By the late 1930s, the stream of consciousness techniques and elusiveness featured prominently in modernist writing. The modernist movement was concerned with the rapid advance of society toward destruction and meaninglessness. In the late 1800s, many of the society's certainties were undermined. Marx demonstrated that social class was created, not inherent. Freud reduced human individuality to an instinctive sex drive. Darwin claimed that the earth was much older than the estimate based on scripture, and Nietzsche argued that morality was a construct. He came out with the conclusion God is dead. Modernist writers looked at the past looking for what was valuable and coherent. Representative authors T.S. Eliot. The French symbolist poetry changed Eliot's whole attitude toward literature. It was Ezra Pound who introduced Eliot to the literary world in 1915. Pound also drastically reduced Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. It was a trailblazing poem. It established Eliot's fame as a rising modernist poet. Eliot advocated the central role of tradition in literature and downplayed the cult of individual genius created by the Romantics. William Faulkner. William Faulkner produced two important books, Sanctuary and Requiem for a Nun. Faulkner created a fictional world in which the past always impinges upon the present. James Joyce. James Joyce is the most important writer of the modernist movement. His life, as well as his works, reflected many of modernism's most central postulates: exile, the presence of the past in one's life, knowledge of a variety of cultures, and self destruction. His novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, was a stream of consciousness narrative of Joyce's own life. In 1922, Joyce published his masterpiece and the single greatest work of modernism, Ulysses. This retelling of the Odysseus myth through the persona of a Jewish advertising salesman is a great work of art. The book was immediately banned in England and the United States for blasphemy and obscenity. Another long novel, Figness Wake, shocked the readers with its incessant wordplay. Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was the originator of Imagism, a school of poetry that explicitly rejected Victorian models of verse by simply presenting images without authorial commentary. Gertrude Stein. Stein's first novel is Three Lives, but she became famous with the publication of the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is actually her own autobiography. She coined the term lost generation to describe the American expatriate writers and artists who began frequenting her after the First World War. Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens rose to fame posthumously. His intellectual poetry influenced Donald Justice and John Ashbery. Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was inspired by Freud and modernist writers. She produced a number of novels. Jacob's Room, Mrs. Dalloway, and To the Lighthouse are her important works. She brought feminist orientation to the forefront of her writing. Representative works. Call It Sleep. Call It Sleep by Henry Roth is perhaps the most notable example of Joycean prose in American literature. In this novel, the writer has employed the stream of consciousness technique to tell the story of an immigrant boy in New York. The novel explores the inmost feelings of this boy during the period of his boyhood. The Cantos. If Ulysses is the most successful work of the modernist movement, Ezra Pound's long poem, The Cantos, is perhaps its most characteristic. Its composition and contents mirror the ideas of the modernists. It is composed of fragments of different voices from different times and places. It attempts to diagnose the ills of the modern world. The Cantos is almost plotless. It moves from hell, perhaps a symbol of utterly fallen civilization, to purgatory, where many historical figures are introduced. Though the poem is considered one of the central works of modernist literature, many scholars dismiss it as an obscure and fascist poem. A Farewell to Arms. A Farewell to Arms was an improvement upon Hemingway's previous work, The Sun Also Rises. The novel tells of Hemingway's own experiences as an ambulance driver during the last days of the First World War, his wounding and convalescence, an affair with a nurse. The novel is noted for Hemingway's revolutionary technique of writing. His prose is terse and journalistic, stripped of adjectives and any construction which may obscure the intended meaning. Harmonium. Harmonium was Wallace Stevens' first book of poetry. While modernist poetry, written by Pound and Eliot, was elusive, fragmentary, and melancholic, Stevens' work was light and lyrical. In Harmonium, Stevens exhibited a verbal dandyism, delighting in the sounds of words. His work bore the influence of Keats and Marvell, whereas other modernists drew their inspiration from Browning, Shakespeare, and Dante. But there is more to Stevens' poetry than meets the eye. His poems exhibit the characteristic modernist fear of nihilism. In The Snowman, for instance, Stevens listened to nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. In his later books, Stevens produced longer philosophical poems that questioned the place of art in human cognition. Surprisingly, by the 1970s and 1980s, Stevens, not Eliot or Pound, was a source of inspiration for hundreds of American poets. The Sound and the Fury. Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury, contains most successful experiments with time. It is the story of the fall of the Compson family that culminates in the suicide of its son. Told by a series of narrators, the stories in the book provide different perspectives on the same events, and it is difficult to understand what really happened. Most difficult is the narration of Benji, a retarded boy who has no conception of time. In his narration, there is no differentiation between what happened years ago, what happened yesterday, and what is happening now. Faulkner exercised a great influence on Latin American writers, especially on the practitioners of magical realism. Tender Buttons. Gertrude Stein's book Tender Buttons was a collection of poetry. In her poetry, Stein seeks to rename objects on the basis of prosody, rhythm, and intonation. The book does read like lyrical prose in short paragraphs. To the Lighthouse. Virginia Woolf perfected the stream of consciousness technique in her novels of the 1920s. Her novel, To the Lighthouse, depicts the Ramsay family who is spending the summer on the Isle of Skye. There is an air of unreality about this novel. The mingling of past and present is the secret of its unity. Ulysses. Ulysses, the single greatest work of modernism literature, is considered to be the finest novel ever written. It was written in 10 years. It is about a meticulously detailed day in the life of three Dubliners. The main characters are Leopard Bloom, his unfaithful wife, and Stephen Dedalus, a dissipated young man. The story parallels Homer's Odyssey but translates that epic journey of 10 years to 18 hours and one city. Upon its publication, and even before, when fragments were published, the novel was hailed as a great success. The Wasteland. Eliot's Wasteland is the single most important modernist poem. Essentially plotless, the poem attempts to capture historical development to the present day by the use of allusion. Characters such as Tiresias, the Smyrna merchant, and an East London housewife wander through the poem. London, the unreal city in the fog, becomes the synecdoche for the fallen world as a whole. The poem moves from Elizabethan times to the ancient world to the present and ends, finally, with a small failing voice speaking Sanskrit. Interestingly, in its original version, the poem was 6 times as long, but at Pound's insistent, Eliot removed the sequential links between the vignettes and the poem was reduced to a series of fragments. Most critics agree that the poem expresses a fundamental despair at the sense that, with the loss of all certainties, the world is nothing but a heap of fragments. Though the wasteland is notorious for its complexity, even the most basic reading evokes a sense of desperation and loss. To conclude, it can be said that modernism was a revolutionary movement which affected Western culture, art, literature, and politics in the first half of 20th century. It stepped into the chaos created by the loss of certainties during the two world wars and looked wistfully back at the coherence of past, as Eliot himself puts it, mixing memory and desire. I shall be explaining this further in part 2. Thank you.